So with this, let's turn our thoughts towards our topic for today. As I mentioned, Rett syndrome is an early childhood onset disorder with a prognosis of living well into adulthood. We all have a very deep and loving relationship to our loved ones with Rett syndrome, and the underpinnings of this relationship are dependent on us having a true understanding of the nature of the diagnosis, acknowledging the real divide that we must cross between the love and dreams for our children and the reality of the nature of this disorder. And too often, our best efforts with physical therapy, movement, positioning, communication, education, the enriched environment are not enough to completely prevent the challenges of Rett syndrome. And we all dream of transformative treatments and one day a cure. We are so grateful to have experts like Dr. Benke and Rettland to help guide our decision making at this incredible moment in time when our many hopes and dreams are coming into focus in the form of clinical trials. So we've asked Dr. Benke to join us today to talk about what is a clinical trial, to talk about the phases of clinical trials, to talk about what goes into developing clinical trials and what trials are available to you today. Our goal is to educate and inform you. As a foundation, and as a team of presenters, we're not here to coerce you into participating in a trial. We're not going to hype any particular trial. We don't want to guilt anyone who is unable to participate in a trial. But we are asked all the time about what trials are available and is my child eligible? So we want to use this webcast today to understand today's state of the trials, options available to you, to help you decide what one might be right for you and your family, and to arm you with information that you can go back and talk to your physician when making that decision. Dr. Benke is going to share this website address, but I can't repeat it often enough that the most up-to-date trial-specific information can most often be found in clinicaltrials.gov. And of course, you can always visit rettsyndrome.org for information on trials, helpful guides, and videos. So with that information, I'd like to stop talking now and turn our presentation over to Dr. Benke. Are you ready, Dr. Benke?
Yes, I'm ready. If you want to go ahead and share. Okay.
Great.
You should now be able to see my screen. You can see my screen okay?
We sure can. Thank you. Go ahead and begin.
So thanks very much, Paige and everyone there who's signed up. Thanks, Paige, for asking me to do this. I think it's very important that I also recognize not only my disclosures here. Oops, trying to make it advance. I can't. Oh, there we go. Not only recognizing my disclosures here, but also recognizing that I've been very fortunate to work with a strong team of researchers, both locally here, but importantly across the country. This has been very much a team effort where everybody's come together to work in a very selfless way, and I couldn't be more grateful to the team that I've been able to be a part of. So important disclosures for this talk today is that I do participate in scientific advisory and trial participation for some of the trials that we're talking about today. I also receive funding support from a number of different groups where I provide scientific advisory. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about Clinical Trials 101, the basics that I think that families and other folks need to know, just in terms of the sorts of questions that I've received from other people. I'll then talk about clinical trials that are active in Rett, CDKL5 deficiency disorder, FOXG1, and MECP2 duplication syndrome. So this is a very exciting time. Here we are. This is what we've all been waiting for, treatment that's specific to Rett syndrome. How do we have to get there? This is research through the clinical trial process. And it's important to remember that this is research. It's not treatment. Yes, you would receive potentially a treatment as part of a clinical trial, but it's not treatment. It is research to try to decide if that particular treatment is, most importantly, safe as well as beneficial. The process happens that with a successful trial, we will get to FDA approval, which would then result in availability of treatment. And this is the ideal fashion about how things can go. Availability of treatment has to do with a lot of other things, such as insurance and payers and those sorts of questions. But certainly the first step is a successful trial in that pathway. So as part of this, I really appreciate those folks that have submitted questions ahead of time, and I look forward to getting to those as well as other questions that come in. But this is an opportunity for you to get informed, and if you're ready, if you want to, if you think this is right for you, to enroll. The other aspect is to be patient. Clinical trials happen in a very intense regulatory and contractual environment. It's not as easy as me just scheduling you as if you were a patient tomorrow. I would love it if it were that way, but there's a lot of steps that we go through in order to start clinical trials. So thank you for your patience and bearing with us as we get these trials started. So clinical trials basics, the 101. What is a clinical study? What is a clinical trial? Where these are a process by which subjects, caregivers, consent or assent to participate in a defined study designed to produce information that can be used to understand or study or help the population as a whole. This data is peer-reviewed and published to advance the knowledge and effective and safe treatments of the disease. Trials are interventions. You do not have to participate in a clinical trial unless you want to participate. Participating is work on your part. It involves consent, in some cases using de-identified data. You opt out versus opt in. And it's important to note that if you participate in any clinical trial, you can withdraw at any time. And all of these issues are part of the consent form that you review as part of the clinical trial. It's a document that you sign. It's a legal document. So you should have all the time in the world to be comfortable with what you sign in that regard. It's important to note that in order to get to that point, a review board must approve the trial before any subjects are contacted or enrolled. And there are international rules of standards and ethics that are always applied. Clinical trials have phases. Phase 1 is testing usually healthy volunteers at multiple doses, but this may be in patients with advanced stages of the disease or diseases with no known treatments. Phase 2 is testing on patients for efficacy and safety. Often this phase will involve multiple doses in order to determine that. Phase 3 is confirmatory. This is testing on patients for efficacy, effectiveness, and safety, and it's usually in much larger numbers than in either of the two phases. The FDA typically will approve for use after phase 3, but this isn't always the case. We have seen recently in some rare diseases where they have gone from phase 1 to approval. Clinical trials, what are the types? So it's important to note this first note that I have here on placebo-controlled. What is a placebo? A placebo is not a better word for it, but is sometimes called a sugar pill. It's used to make sure that the effects of a trial are real. And this is important because patients with epilepsy can see a 25% reduction in seizures with a placebo. This is true for almost anything in neurology, even headaches. The placebos can be very effective, if you will, in seeing an effect. Randomize. Who gets placebo or drug is a flip of the coin. 2 patients, you flip the coin, heads you get it, tails you don't. That's just the way it is. We don't flip the coin, but a computer does. Double blind. This is subjects and local study personnel do not know who is getting drug. You can ask us, but we don't know in a double blind trial. You will not know. Everything is done to make sure that I don't know and that you don't know as part of a trial. Open label is a type of trial where everyone is getting drug. Crossover means those getting drug at one point in the trial then get placebo and vice versa. And again, this is usually randomized and double blind as well. Extension. This is access to a drug after a trial ends. It's usually an open label continuation of the trial. So with the access to the drug after the trial ends, it really still is part of the trial and that assessments will continue to happen. The gold standard for trials is randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. This is the gold standard set by the FDA and other agencies to decide that this is the right way to do a trial and that they can believe the results are real. A screening visit. This is the first visit to make sure that a subject meets the inclusion or exclusion criteria for a trial. Inclusion and exclusion criteria, these are usually things such as age, weight, specifics of the disease, other medication use, recent trial experience, etc. These are not set up by the investigator, such as myself. These are set up by the company and in careful and close review with the FDA before they're given the green light to proceed with the trial. Duration. This is the duration of treatment during the trial, but it also has to do with durations after the screening visit before that first baseline visit of the trial. Study visits. These are specifically timed for the trial to get good data. They're not that flexible. They're usually only plus or minus a few days, not a few weeks, and they're not optional. You have to show up for you to be in the trial. The study coordinator that's local to each site will work with the families to try to fit it into their schedule. They happen over the duration of the trial. We try everything possible because we want you to participate in the trials. So we want this to be family friendly, and this has been considered at every aspect to make sure that this is the case as much as possible. Endpoints and outcomes. These are the measurables used to determine safety and efficacy. The goal is for clean data. That's why we're very strict about inclusion and exclusion criteria. This was an issue that came up at a recent initiation visit for a trial, and there are no exceptions to the exclusion and exclusion criteria. Once you make an exception, then what's the point? So these are very strict. So we need to be sure that a drug is safe and effective. And we're doing this in such a controlled environment because this is research, it's not treatment. And the goal is ideally that post-approval, that this should be available to all who meet certain disease criteria aspects for a drug. So another point to make is that we want good data. So having the same caregiver present at each visit is something that is often felt to ensure consistent data is obtained during a trial. Clinical trials. So where to go when you want information on this? Do you go to Facebook? I would say no. Facebook posts have been known to contaminate trials, even ruin them, make the data unusable in trials in the past, not necessarily for Rett, but for other things. Email, internet, blogs, me, I would say none of this, none of these. I'm not going to endorse any particular trial, though I will participate in some, but I could be your source if you're coming to see me as part of a study visit to determine inclusion or inclusion. But where you go is you need to trust but verify, and the only real sources are Clinicaltrialsgov or websites that have sourced from there, the company website, and certainly that legal document, the consent form for the study. And then also the study investigators. You can talk to a study investigator after they have had their local investigational review board approve the trial at their site. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the ever important NIH-funded natural history study. So the NIH-funded natural history study of Rett and Rett-related disorders has followed over 1,000 patients through 2013. This is for MECP2, CDKL5, and FOXG1 related disorders, where we're trying to establish genotype and phenotype, epilepsy, GI, scoliosis, life expectancy, and to create published standards. We are funded through September of 2020. Unfortunately, this was not renewed. There are different protocols that are part of the study. 5211 is the parent protocol, meaning you have to be in that to be in the other protocols. 5212 is neurophysiological biomarkers. 5213 is genetic and metabolomic metabolic biomarkers. 5214 is behavioral analyses. It's important to note that these study visits typically occur separately from a regular clinic visit. There's too many things that usually have to happen as part of that. These visits often will take 1 to 2 hours, and so it's not possible to do these as part of a regular clinic visit. And I want to define what a biomarker is. A biomarker is an objective measure of disease severity or predictive of disease progression or predictive of response to treatment. These are things such as perhaps a blood test or an EEG, where without parental input or an exam, we obtain this biomarker and it says something about these issues of disease severity, disease progression, or response to treatment. This is something that the FDA and other funding bodies want us to establish as part of these diseases. So the investigating group is here listed. The chair is Alan Percy at UAB, along with Jeff Newell at, oh, I should have updated this. I apologize, I need to fix this slide. Jeff is now at Vanderbilt. He has been for some time. I should have fixed this slide. Site PIs include Eric Marsh at Philadelphia, myself here at Colorado, Dr. Sahin at Boston Children's, Dr. Peters at Vanderbilt, Dr. Paszczykowski at Rochester. Anyway, here's the list here. I won't read through all of those folks that are on the list. But many institutions, Greenwood, Baylor, Rush, UCSF, listed here. So our current enrollment, 2013 to now, 749 MECP2 positive subjects with Rett, atypical Rett, and intellectual disability, 69 subjects with MECP2 duplication, 55 with FOXG1, 63 with CDKL5. Those folks that are under 10 years of age are seen annually, 10 to 20 biannually, and those that are over 20, we try to see twice during the current funding cycle. I would like to say that I think our challenge has been with the natural history study is that our older and sicker patients, while they might be interested in a clinic visit, it's hard for them to participate in these longer study visits. 5212, this is the neurophysiological biomarkers. We've enrolled 153, 140 analyzed. You can see the breakdown there. Basically, the summary so far is auditory evoked potentials and visual evoked potentials are different between groups and when compared to controls. But we're still working on a lot of aspects of this to see if we can use this as a biomarker, but so far things are promising. Eric Marsh at CHOP has been the lead in this important study. What have been our deliverables so far? We've published over 50 papers on Rett, CDD, MECP2 duplication syndrome, and FOXG1. Recent papers are a paper on MECP2 males, MECP2 duplication syndrome, some comparisons, and 3 papers on CDKL5 deficiency disorder, a summary, a description of cortical visual impairment, and a severity assessment. Planned and in process deliverables, there's a disorders comparisons paper, biomarker evaluation, healthcare supervision guidelines. These are all in the process and hope to be coming out soon in the new year. So the first trial that I want to talk about is the Ketamine Trial. This is the title here that I have in quotes, as I do with the other studies. It's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, crossover study to assess the safety, tolerability, and efficacy of oral ketamine for patients with Rett syndrome. So you can see all of those terms that I mentioned in the earlier slides, so you can know what sort of trial this is by reading the title. So it's using ketamine. It's a phase 2 study. Essentially, there's 5 days of drug or placebo, then a washout, meaning we wait a period of time for the drug to come out of one system. Then there's 5 days of drug or placebo, and then washout. This trial happens over 8 to 10 weeks total. It's in 6 to 12-year-olds who have not started to have their period, who have typical Rett syndrome. The sponsor is Rett Syndrome Research Trust. The primary endpoint is safety. Secondary endpoints are the Clinical Global Impression of Improvement, Motor Behavioral Score, Rett Syndrome Behavioral Questionnaire, and others. The goal is 48 subjects, and you can see clinicaltrials.gov for the site list. And here is the website on reverseret.org, which is the RSRT, Rett Syndrome Research Trust website. The next study is the Greenwich Pharmaceuticals CBD Study. This is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial to investigate the efficacy and safety of cannabidiol oral solution, and here's the official name for the product, GWP 42003-P, CBD-OS, in patients with Rett syndrome. This is purified CBD, also known as the FDA-approved formulation, Epidiolex. It is a phase 3 trial. It has a double-blind, placebo-controlled 24-week initial phase, followed by a 6-month open-label extension. The sponsor is Greenwich Pharmaceuticals. It's in patients 2 to 18 years of age who are over 9 kilograms. It's for patients that meet criteria for typical and atypical Rett syndrome. The primary endpoints are the Rett syndrome behavioral questionnaire and the clinical global impression of improvement. The goal is for 252 subjects, and please see clinicaltrials.gov for the site list. Important note is to check this site over and over because it does change as new sites come online. When their contractual process has been approved, then new sites will appear. So if you don't see your favorite site, check again. They might show up there. There is a screening website as well, and it's actually through an email. So you email medinfo@gbio.com. The next one is the Trophenite Study. So this is, quote, the study of Trophenite for the treatment of girls and women with Rett syndrome, and they're calling it the Lavender Study. The drug is Trophenite. It's a phase 3 trial. It's double-blind, placebo-controlled over 12 weeks. The sponsor is Acadia Pharmaceuticals. This is for patients 5 to 20 years of age who are greater than 12 kilograms who have typical Rett syndrome. The primary endpoints are the Rett syndrome behavioral questionnaire and the clinical global impression of improvement. The goal is for 184 subjects. Again, see clinicaltrials.gov for the site list, and again, note that it changes. And here's the screening website listed there at the bottom of the screen. The next thing to talk to you about Trophenite is from the company website. Quote, the Lavender phase 3 study will be followed by Lilac, a 40-week open label extension study. So all participants completing the 12-week Lavender study may be eligible to enroll in the Lilac study, in which all study participants will receive Trophenite and be followed as part with regular scheduled visits to evaluate the long-term tolerability and safety of the drug. Trophenite has been granted fast track status, an orphan drug designation for Rett syndrome in the US, and orphan drug designation for Rett syndrome in Europe. The next trial to talk about is the ANAVEX trial. So, quote, a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled dose titration study of ANAVEX 2-73 in patients with Rett syndrome. The drug being used is ANAVEX 2-73. This is a phase 2, double-blind, placebo-controlled, with 7 weeks of treatment and a 12-week open-label extension. The sponsor is ANAVEX. This is a trial open to those that are over 18 and plus who have typical Rett syndrome. The primary endpoints are safety and pharmacokinetics. In other words, they're studying how different doses of the drug appear in the bloodstream. Secondary endpoints are the clinical global impression of improvement and the Rett syndrome behavioral questionnaire. The goal is 20 plus subjects, and please see clinicaltrials.gov for the site list, and here's is the screening website listed there below. The next trial is the SYRIZATAN trial. It is, quote, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled 6-month study to evaluate the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of SYRIZATAN in patients with Rett syndrome with respiratory symptoms. So this trial is active, but it's not recruiting. And there is the website. So what this means is the trial has, I believe, essentially finished recruiting unless they decide to reopen it again in the future. The next thing to chat about is gene therapy. And here I'm just reading to you from the AVEXIS Novartis press release, which was subsequently posted on the RSRT or reverseRett.org website. So, quote, due to the data integrity concerns related to specific animal testing procedure used in the development of Zolgensma and included in the application, we have decided to also review data quality and compliance with the preclinical work performed for AVEXIS 201, our Rett syndrome gene therapy candidate. Out of caution and to ensure that we have a robust data package for the FDA, we have chosen to repeat and add additional pivotal preclinical studies as well as new quality controls. Once these studies are completed, we will submit the revised IND, this is the investigational new drug application, to the FDA with the goal of rapidly progressing to clinical trials in Rett syndrome patients. We expect that conducting these additional studies and completing the IND will take until the middle of 2020. At that time, we will be in a position to provide further updates to the Rett syndrome community. There you go. So Zolgensma, by the way, is the FDA approved drug for spinal muscular atrophy, just to clarify what that is there. So to talk about trials in other disorders, in CDKL5 deficiency disorder, there is a study involving Ganaxone. This is the study of adjunctive Ganaxone treatment in children and young adults with CDKL5 deficiency disorder. It's also called the Marigold Study. So Ganaxone, by the way, is a positive GABA receptor allosteric modulator. It's in phase 3. They are recruiting. It's run by Marinus Pharmaceuticals. It's double-blind, placebo-controlled. There's a baseline period and then a 17-week add-on placebo or Ganaxone, then followed by open label with Ganaxone. The primary endpoint is reduction in seizures. The goal is 100 participants, ages 2 to 21 years of age, in patients with CDKL5 deficiency disorder. And there is the Marigold Study website. The next study for CDKL5 deficiency disorder is TAC935. This is, quote, a multicenter open label pilot study of TAC935 in participants with 15q duplication syndrome or cyclin-dependent kinase-like 5 deficiency disorder. It's called the ARCADE study. This involves a 24 cholesterol hydroxylase inhibitor, which reduces the expression of a certain type of channel called NMDA receptors. It's in a phase 2 study sponsored by Takeda and Ovid Therapeutics. It is an open label trial. It involves a baseline period followed by 20 weeks of treatment and then an open label extension. The primary endpoint is reduction in seizures, and the goal is 30 participants, 15 of these with CDKL5 deficiency disorder, and the age range is 2 to 35 years of age. There is a plan for gene therapy for CDKL5 deficiency disorder, and this is just pulled from the Ultragenyx website, talking about how they are planning to pursue this. So how does all of this work? So really, this is why we and others have a Rett clinic. So we know you, and we will pre-screen you because we've seen you, and we'll call you if you qualify. But if you are really interested, then be squeaky and let us know. And if you want to know directly if you qualify, then you can call and email your clinic. And just be aware of the callbacks regarding this may be delayed for many reasons. And this has to do with, we can't call you and talk to you about a trial unless we're actually activated, which means that all of that contracting and regulatory issues are in place. But be squeaky. Call, your name gets put on usually a site list that you're interested by the study coordinator at that site, and that's very useful to us when we're trying to let the company know that we're ready to go on a trial, and then we can get going quickly if we have a nice list of names. Be aware that there's screening and baseline visits for a trial, and these usually add about 4 weeks to the total trial time. But at the screening visit, we're going to verify if you qualify, and you may not due to study specifics. And like I said, we can't change those rules. There aren't exceptions to these. But also note that I may not be able to tell you what these specifics are in order to avoid any bias in the study. So these are very specific things that the company has set up in order to obtain clean data. Travel is often part of the trial budget and included there to support you, but sometimes this may not be enough, and there's other resources, and I'm really pleased that we're going to have a discussion about this from Rettland as part of the call today. So what does the process look like? So there is, as I said, there's that screening visit, and then after that, once we're sure that somebody qualifies as part of that screening visit, then you get enrolled, and there might be a baseline visit after you've qualified, and at the baseline visit you are randomized. There's that flip of the coin, and you either are on drug or you're not, and we don't know because it's typically double blind. And then each one of these little bubbles here, these are clinical visits, trial visits during the clinical trial. And as I said, these are often plus or minus a day or two, not plus or minus a week as part of the trial. So once you make your baseline visit, the study coordinator often sets these up ahead of time. So it's useful for everybody to know what their schedule is when setting these up. Then there's the last clinical trial visit, and all of the data on a particular subject is collected. Most of the times there's after the clinical trial visits as well. So you're treated with drug here. This might be the part where you go into the open label extension, or it might be there's follow-up phone calls after exposure to the drug has finished. And I just want to say thanks very much because I stole the slide from my colleagues at CHOP. So that's Clinical Trials 101. And we talked about clinical trials specifically in Rett and CDKL5 deficiency disorder. And in order to move this forward, we really can't do this without your help. And so I hope that this was useful to you, and I look forward to trying to answer your questions today. And so that's where we are now. So Paige, we can go back to you taking over the screen, and you can read me the questions you have so far, and those more questions that start coming in.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Benke. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and it's kind of like speed dating. You went through all of the trials, all of the criteria, phases in a very short time, and I appreciate that because this is not easy stuff. And we are going to have ample time for question and answer after the conclusion of our presentations. So there are a few things that I'm asked very regularly from families, and you touched on all of these, and I just put together a small table here that really highlights the difference between participating in research and seeing a doctor. I hope you don't mind that I took that liberty. I pulled this from a participant's guide to Rett syndrome that we have on our website. And I think it's important for us as families to think about these differences because we're often going to, if we enroll in a clinical trial, it's going to be at the clinic where, it might be at the clinic where we take our child for regular clinical visits. And it may not be, but it's really important to think about the difference between participating in research versus scheduling an appointment with your doctor. So I just wanted to run through these real quick. And it's a recap of the things you talked about, and then we'll turn the presentation over to Colleen to talk a little bit about support in participating in a trial. So reminder that the goal of research is to learn about Rett syndrome, whereas the goal when you make an appointment to see your doctor is to get treatment for a specific condition or symptom or problem that your child's having. So to flip back, once you go to participate in research, the standards, the protocol, the procedures are set and have to be followed to follow the scientific method. Whereas going to a doctor for treatment, they're going to customize and change dosage, medications, recommendations based on your specific child, as opposed to studying the research protocol. In a research study, your child might get the study drug or they might get a placebo. if it's a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and we do have some questions to further clarify why some trials have placebo and some don't. But if you go to your doctor for a particular symptom with your child, they're going to prescribe a medication. They're not going to be given a placebo. It will be an active drug, and it will be the best standard of treatment that's currently available today, not an experimental procedure. Research is trying to get at the safety and efficacy of an experimental medication. Side effects aren't always known. That's part of the research protocol. However, Dr. Benke did accurately say that every approved clinical trial is approved by each site's internal review board, which involves an ethics committee and a rigorous review of the protocol. If your doctor is prescribing an FDA-approved medication, those side effects and benefits have been studied in the population. In research, participants may be asked to undergo procedures such as blood tests, EEGs, imaging and scans, and complete questionnaires. That's to feed data to the research study. It's not to necessarily give feedback to you about your child. However, if you are doing a procedure or answering questionnaires at a doctor visit, it's because those particular tests are necessary to evaluate your child's condition and create a course of treatment. In research, medical and other costs associated with participation, such as travel in a research study, may be partly or fully covered. And for a regular doctor visit, you are ultimately responsible for treatment or payment or co-pays per your insurance situation, which also limits sometimes limits what doctors you can see in what state, in what country, etc. Some of those same restrictions do not apply to research. Research is really not dependent on your insurance. And I wanted to end on that part about travel and support for the costs associated to help us segue to our special guest speaker, Colleen English. Colleen, I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over to you.
Are we going to do questions now from folks, or are we going to wait till after we do Colleen's presentation?
You know what? I think Colleen is going to answer some of the questions that are in the queue. Okay. So if we can, we are doing really well on time. And
can I add something to this slide? Is that okay, Paige?
Yeah, please.
So I want to mention to people this notion of when you see the doctor, the middle thing there, physicians prescribe FDA-approved medicines whose side effects and benefits have been studied. So in pediatric neurology and in neurology in general, there are a number of things that might be done off-label. What does that mean? That means that I'm using a drug that's been approved by the FDA for other conditions or other situations, but not necessarily the one for which I'm prescribing it. With anything that your doctor prescribes you, or with the trial as well, FDA approved or not, there should be a healthy discussion about any risks and benefits for what you're about to participate in. And so that would be an important discussion. The issue about off-label use means that even though the drug is FDA approved, it doesn't necessarily mean that your insurance company or or payer may not necessarily pay for that treatment. So I just wanted to clarify that issue there.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification.
It's a subtlety.
But an important one.
Yes.
Important one, especially as many of these medications are not inexpensive and many medications have not been tested, for example, in pediatric populations. Right, but they're approved for adult usage and are commonly prescribed for pediatrics at this point. So that's considered an off-label use, right?
Right.
And I think in Rett syndrome, probably the most common one is things like Prevacid, right? Things for reflux, right? It's a good one. Okay, so I really appreciate you clarifying that, Dr. Benke. Okay, so if your time allows, let's let Colleen talk a little bit about Rettland and how Rettland is here to support families through the clinical trial process, and then we'll go to the questions in the QA session. Okay? There we go. So Colleen English is a managing director of a nonprofit organization called Rettland. She's going to talk about a little bit from her personal experience. See, Colleen, I think your slides. There we go. There we go. All right, so she's going to talk about a personal experience that motivated her to start this wonderful foundation that is helping countless families participate in clinical trials and clinical research. And we want to thank you so much for joining us today, Colleen. I'm going to go ahead and turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to get to have a voice in this discussion, and I'm privileged to be able to do the work that I do. I have a daughter who's now Claire, who is 14, and she has Rett syndrome, and I never intended to open a nonprofit. This sort of happened maybe out of desperation. We were at physical therapy one day about 7 years ago, and I was telling the physical therapist about how there was a trial in Boston, and we lived in California, Northern California, and which is very far from Boston. And so I was telling the therapist, it's really a shame. We would love to do this, but it's expensive, it's hard, and we'll just have to wait for other people to do it and wait for maybe in a few years, we'll see if anything comes from it. And my daughter, Claire, she was on a treadmill in a harness, and she picked her legs up and bent her knees and to stop walking and looked straight at me as if to say, wait a minute, there's an option. And at that moment, I realized, I don't know that I'd asked her. And it started a series of conversations between her and our then 5-year-old at the time. This led to more discussions within our Rett syndrome community, and I learned that there was a study that had 15 people, but it needed 30, and it was a pretty high bar to go to Boston 7 times. I think it was a total of 49 nights. And in the process of thinking, can we do it? I started with, of course not. And then as we thought about it a little bit more and talked to people, we had family that said, well, we could give this much money to help you guys. And talking to other people, that we had friends that were able to come and clean our house while we were out of town, just to reduce our burden. And we found that there was an incredible power in doing things with the help of other people. And as I started talking to other families in the Rett syndrome community, I found out that there was a lot of people that wanted to be more involved, and they just didn't have the support. So I kind of gathered together a few other Rett families that felt very passionate about this, and we started Rettland Foundation. So what we've grown slowly, as it's crazy that 5 years ago, we were trying to scrape together with lemonade stands enough money to help 10 families get to Boston. And we were able to cover just a fraction of their costs, but it was enough to make their burden a little less. And now, let me advance my slide here. That's my daughter, Claire, in Boston during one of our study visits. So we currently are working with families in the ANAVEX-273 trial, in the GW CBD trial, and ketamine, as well as the STARS trial. There's still people actively participating in that, and we work with families in all of those different trials. We book a lot of flights for people and hotel rooms so that they don't have to be out the money in advance, because it can be a significant hurdle. And I thought, if I can make it easier, maybe we could all get enrollment and get full, complete data sets. So that's pretty much our simple goal, is to make the travel part less of a problem. And so we coordinate with some of the pharmaceutical companies, some of the sponsors for funding. when possible so that we can cover everybody's expenses. We also try to send care packages and encouragement, as it can be a taxing process, just gentle reminders of the work that's happening and that we see them. It's small but important. Recently, we sent a care package to one of the families in the ANAVEX trial. Their daughter is 46 years old. And I wanted to share this with everybody listening. The email that I got from her said, "Tell the families we appreciate their support in anticipation of better days for our loved ones. We know this could lead to better treatments, and we want the best for our girls." And none of this is certain, but it's just so profound to me that this family, who's their daughter with Rett syndrome is 46 years old, and they've seen the whole continuum of research, and they're going to great lengths just that maybe it could be better. And so I just want to humbly say thank you to everyone who's even considering this, everyone who has participated in research. As slow as this feels, our community is really mobilizing and moving along quite quickly on the research front, that we have so many active trials, families in so many states. Which leads me to my next part. Call me, contact me. If you think that clinical research is right for you and you want to ask specific questions about what it is that we do or how we could help you, I would love to talk to you. I'm not a doctor. I will tell you nothing about which trial would be better for you. That is something that you need to discuss with the sites. I can tell you which airports have terrible weather patterns. I can tell you which hotels have great ADA showers and which cities have really easy accessible cabs. And if you have a screening visit, then we can help make the arrangements for you. So with that, I think hopefully I answered some questions, but I'd love to hear from you. If so, I'll turn it back, Paige. I don't know how you.
Thank you, Colleen. And we really owe you a great debt of gratitude for starting the foundation, and from your grassroots efforts to fundraise yourself to now being in contracts and supports with many of the study sponsors who are able to make provisions for travel support with you. We know that it all comes from your heart, for you, your team, your board, who want to do everything that you can to accelerate the successful completion of these trials. We know their research. We know there is no guarantee that these will go on to become approved compounds, but these compounds have proven, many of these compounds have shown great promise in preclinical trials and preclinical studies in the lab, in other human conditions, or sometimes these are new trials and new conditions. And the study teams themselves are working day and night on top of their regular clinic schedules to coordinate these research projects for our families, and the companies themselves have a lot of work that they have to do to meet regulatory requirements and to ensure the biochemistry of the compound and the placebos and the protocols and the designs meet all of the rigorous standards that are required to bring these to our children. And I am grateful for the partnership that RettSyndrome.org has with Rettland to make sure that families are always part of the conversation for trial design, trial process, screening, enrollment, and in publishing and sharing information about outcomes. So thank you very much for being with us today to share how Rettland can support families in that process. Dr. Benke, what I'd like to do now is turn the screen control back over to you so that as folks have questions, you can go back into your slides.
Okay.
If you're willing.
Yes.
To do that, because I think, great, just take a minute. Did I take you by unawares? Okay.
I swallowed a bite of lunch. We're good.
Well, thank you. And I know that you're at another meeting, and we really appreciate you taking time out of that meeting to do the presentation today. I really cannot emphasize enough how many different hats you wear in the course of a day, much less in an hour. And we will absolutely allow you to have a bite of lunch once this is done. I'll buy you lunch.
No worries.
Okay, so
Ready when you
what
are.
I'd like to do is go through the questions that were submitted in the queue, remind everyone who is attending today that if you have any questions for either of our presenters, including myself, go ahead and type them into the queue, and we have a good bit of time today. Everyone got through their content really quickly, so I want to ask.
So
First question
how do people do that, by the way, Paige? Is that through the chat part of?
Yeah, so a reminder that in the GoToWebinar dashboard that is on your screen, there's a chat or question box, should have a gray background. If you click on that, you can type in a question, and a number of people have already submitted some questions.
Great. All right, ready.
Okay, great. Okay, so the first question is from a family who lives outside of the United States, and they want to know if their child is could be potentially eligible for a clinical trial that is happening in the United States.
So the answer is maybe. It depends where they're coming from. As mentioned, the study visits, the timing is fairly rigorous, so the family would have to ensure that they can travel for all of those visits. One of the issues is a family might say, oh, well, I'll just come live where the trial is for that period of time. The reason why that may not work is that we want families to continue to receive their usual therapies during a trial, because otherwise that would become a confounding issue during the trial if suddenly during the trial you were not having therapies. So it needs to work out such that you can continue doing what you're usually doing as much as possible. Otherwise, it might become an exclusion for you participating in the trial. The other issue that came up is to see if you can take the study drug home with you. So in other words, that drug would have to cross with you in the airport if you're taking the drug home with you from the trial. Some trials will actually ship drug to you, and this might be an issue with whether or not the trial is able to ship the drug across borders. Some trials will have a nurse that does home visits, and that would of course depend if that's available in your country as part of the trial. So those are some of the issues that would impact whether or not, as being from another country, you can participate in a trial. So I think that it's possible, but there are some hurdles that would have to be overcome, but it's not impossible.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Benke. Colleen, is there anything that you'd like to add to that if you've helped any international families participate in a trial in the US?
Yeah, there are a lot of Canadian families that are able to, I've seen that as a common thing. One of the limiting factors can also be we have sometimes limits on the amount of airfare we can pay for. So but often international flights that are really far, we have limits. And a lot of the budgeting and when we plan for costs, it's assuming local travel.
And just to say that
I should say
during a trial, it might be a 20-week trial. You might be having visits. It could be every 2 to 3 weeks. So it's a lot of visits, and that's a lot of disruption for families.
Thank you. But I know families are very committed, especially if you live in a country where there are not established centers, there's not a lot of readily available drugs, and you are completely committed to doing everything you can to advance research. So the answer in a nutshell is no, you are not excluded, but you do absolutely want to carefully consider the trial and get on the phone with somebody to discuss your particular situation and what are the requirements and what might be all the nuances to enable you to participate. Thank you. Good question, and one that comes often. And many of the sites were focusing on US clinical trials today, but some of those trials are multi-center, multi-country trials. So if you are in a country in Europe and you're looking at a study that we talked about today in the US, go into clinicaltrials.gov and you will find all the centers that are listed, and it may very well be that a particular trial is happening in another country near you. And there are also other trials that are happening outside of the US. Very valid. The company might be an offshore company and they are doing it in the country where they're headquartered. So the trials that we discussed today are not an exhaustive list of all the clinical trials that are currently underway. So as Dr. Benke said, I've shared in the slide, visit clinicaltrials.gov. It's not the easiest website to navigate. You can always contact me and I can help you to work through. But if you scroll through the pages and pages of information listed under Rett syndrome clinical trials, you will eventually see all of the locations that also include countries outside of the United States where trials might be happening. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question in our queue, and if at any time someone has asked a question and we don't get a complete answer for you, go ahead and submit a follow-up question in the queue and we'll get further clarification. Okay, next question is, my daughter is 20 years old and no longer has hand stereotypies. They're very still these days, which I know for many of us that is something that we dream of. But she's wondering if that can be an exclusion criteria because she did a questionnaire over the phone with a researcher and there were a lot of questions about hand movements. I'll stop there. Dr. Benke, I think I know what that questionnaire probably was, but I'm going to turn this over to you to answer.
So the issue is hand stereotypies and your diagnosis of Rett syndrome. So if a trial, and I'm speaking very generally, if what the trial is targeting is hand stereotypies, then they want you to have those as part of the trial so that they can measure them. Another example is, let's say the trial was specifically targeting seizures. Some of seizure trials want you to have, going into the trial, a certain frequency of seizures. So if you're only having one seizure a month, and the trial only lasts 2 months, then it would be really hard to say that the drug is working or not. So if the trial is targeting hand stereotypies, they would want to say if you're having them daily, then they could see if the drug is actually affecting that or not. So that would be the only reason why hand stereotypies, if they were present at one point and then they're not present now, might be an exclusionary criteria for a trial. For participating in the Rett trials, almost all of them, except the GW trial, are focusing on classic or typical Rett syndrome. And as part of that diagnosis, at one point, stereotypies were a predominant issue if you have typical or classic Rett syndrome. Yes, we all know that your hand stereotypies can come and go. So that's not going to change your diagnosis of whether you have typical Rett syndrome or not. But it might change your ability to participate in a trial if that particular symptom was what they were trying to target with that trial. Does that make sense, Paige?
It makes sense to me, and if the person who asked that question needs further clarification, I invite you to write in again, and we'll revisit that. Okay, thank you. All right, next question is, our 19-month-old daughter was diagnosed by a neurologist with a Rett-like phenotype, but her specific genetic mutation has not yet been found. So she meets the clinical criteria for a Rett syndrome diagnosis, but does not have the supporting blood work. Are there any studies that she would qualify for?
I would say not at this time, both due to her age and she doesn't have a genetic diagnosis yet. All of the trials are requiring a change in MECP2 for the Rett-related trials, and of course those trials involving CDKL5 deficiency disorder, they require a change in CDKL5. I would also say that it's difficult to make a diagnosis of Rett syndrome at that age because it's a time when symptoms are rapidly changing.
Okay, and that's usually why the minimum threshold is 2 years old, usually with a qualification of a 6-month period of stabilization. Is that right? To determine if they're post-regression? Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that's why somebody might meet criteria for atypical Rett syndrome at a young age because they quite haven't had time to go through the rest of the symptom checklist to meet a diagnosis of typical Rett syndrome.
Right, and that goes back to the emphasis of what's the difference between research versus a visit to a doctor, right? Research is studying the syndrome as a whole, and therefore the participants need to fit certain criteria,
and typically
so that outcome and data can reflect the syndrome, not the individual.
Right. In other words, we want to make sure that people are in general stable with regards to their symptoms so that we can really assess whether or not a drug is helpful or not.
Mm-hmm. And can you remind us how the natural history study is a research study, but it differs for enrollment than a clinical trial? I think that might be important to this family to know there is something they can participate in.
Yes, so if you have a clinical diagnosis of Rett syndrome, then you can participate in the natural history study. And so in the natural history study, there are patients that have a diagnosis of Rett syndrome, but don't necessarily have a change in MECP2. And that's an opportunity to participate in very important research.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question is, our daughter is 34 years old. She did not have a period of normal growth or development. She never walked or talked, but she does have a confirmed genetic marker for Rett syndrome. Is she eligible for any trials, or is the lack of abilities and severity of her the severity of where she is on the spectrum of Rett syndrome going to make her ineligible for trials as you know them today?
I couldn't answer that unless I actually saw her and did a full history and exam to try to figure that out. But that takes a while. That's why the screening visits are the screening visits, because we might know what we know over the phone, but until you get into the screening visit and we rehash all of the history from day 0 to the present, only then would I know if you fully met the inclusion or exclusion criteria for a trial. So I can't say that she would not without actually, or not necessarily myself, but any of the other investigators actually seeing her to review her. Perhaps if this is one reason to have specialized care in a Rett clinic, because those sorts of things would be known ahead of time by a Rett physician who also participates in the trials and can tell you better whether or not she definitively would or wouldn't qualify for any particular trial. based on her age, the only trials that she would currently qualify for would be either the ANAVEX trial, but most definitely for the natural history study. Would love to see her in the natural history study, because one of the things that I think is lacking is our older patients in the natural history study are really needed so that we can understand what it's like to be an older patient with Rett syndrome. So I would say absolutely find somebody so that you can participate in the natural history study, and then also think about, once they've seen you there, perhaps they can help you with understanding if you qualify for the ANAVEX trial.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to the next question, which is asking if you can explain a little bit about the age restriction for many of the trials. For example, Acadia currently is restricting ages between 5 and 20 years old for phase 3. Does this restriction suggest that trofinetide will not be effective in our older population? Is this something that you can comment on, Dr. Benke?
Before I answer that, I have to say that I'm going to answer it in a very general sense, not necessarily with regard to trofinetide, but for any of these drugs. The hope is that all of them will have benefit outside of the range for which the trial is set up. The age range for the trials is set up to get, as we said before, we want clean data. And so the reason why they're set up with these age ranges are that other special issue with regards to therapy. We know that if you're between 5 to 18, 5 to 20, that's when you're at your peak time for receiving therapies. And we want that lack of therapy versus therapy not to be a confounding variable as to whether it appears that a drug works or doesn't work. So in other words, if we had a trial and it was all ages, for instance, let's say it worked in patients with therapy versus those that didn't, and if we weren't specifically controlling for that, we might get a result that said that it doesn't work, and that wouldn't be the real issue. So the age range for trials is really a reflection of, we want patients to be in their peak years of receiving therapy in terms of making sure that that's not a confound for the trial. Do you think I covered that, Paige, or is there?
You sure did. Yeah. Sorry, my phone was on mute. Silence was not because I was waiting for more information. Great. Okay, the next question in the queue is, would participation in one clinical trial make you ineligible for participation in another clinical trial?
That's a great question. So you can't be in 2 clinical trials at once, is the general hard, fast, written in stone rule, unless you're in the natural history study, because that's not an interventional trial. You can be in the natural history study and any trial at the same time. That's not an issue for the natural history study. But almost all clinical trials where there's an intervention, you can't be in another trial with an intervention at the same time. And usually what a trial will do is they'll say, if you're in a trial, then you have to wait a period of time before you participate in another clinical trial. So it's usually an exclusion criteria. They can't overlap, but there has to be a time lag between when you've completely finished the one trial before you start in the other. And usually it's a couple of months.
Great, thank you. Good question and good answer. Okay, question is, how do I get an appointment to see if my daughter is eligible for a trial? Do I have to sign up for the trial first?
No, you simply, you would call or contact the trial site that's closest to you. You tell them we're interested in the trial, and they're probably going to ask for a few specifics over the phone, like age, weight, or genetic diagnosis, and then they would take your information and try to then see if there's any issues, make sure that you haven't excluded yourself by any particular reasons, and then they would try to schedule you for a screening visit, and they would go over all of these issues as part of that first visit. Most studies are hoping that you bring copies of certain bits of information with you, and that study will tell you what you need to bring. For instance, it might be a copy of the genetic report that they would want you to bring to that first visit. There might be other records that they may ask you to bring to that first visit to help with understanding if you can be excluded or included in the trial. So they would tell you, you would bring that information with you to your screening visit. And again, that would be by you contacting the site, say, I'm interested in this trial, and they would start that process of trying to schedule you for a visit. Great question.
Thank you. Okay, so we had a lot of questions about screening, and another question is, how do you get in contact with the natural history study group?
So the different sites should be listed on the Clinicaltrialsgov website. You can always email Dr. Percy or myself or Dr. Newell. I think our emails are on the web somewhere, or our sites to get in touch, or you can email Paige. Paige knows how to get us.
I didn't pay you to say that, but yes, you can. Anybody can contact me regarding how to find the screening process or direct contact to any of the trial sites. Absolutely. Okay, here's another good question. It's sort of operational about sites. How come it seems like some of the sites come on sooner than others in these studies? Why do some take longer to get activated?
So the question is why does site A get activated before site B? And that has to do completely with the operational aspects of every site are different. So the contracting and lawyers at site A are just different. Maybe there's more of them, maybe they're more efficient than site B. Site A may have more research coordinators that are available, or other aspects. Every site is different. We all have different resources, and that's why it takes a different amount of time for every site to come online. The other aspect is the companies have to often visit sites. It's not often, they have to visit sites before they're activated. So it might just be when the company was able to come out and visit the site. Usually it's more site-specific issues as to why one site comes on sooner than another. There's no other reason other than it really just depends on resources. There's nothing about a site that is deficient or punitive or better in any other regard.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, we have a question. We have quite a few parents on the phone who have a child who is a boy or young man with Rett syndrome, with a MECP2 mutation, and general question consistent across all of these parents is, why are they finding that there aren't trials for their children right now?
So I think those are questions in some regards for the companies, but I think that the companies are thinking, let's have as uniform data as possible. So that's why they're picking females. Let's have as many participants as possible. That's why they're picking females. And so that's why I believe those are the reasons. The companies are very much thinking about males in terms of, we really want this to be available. We would like to study this in as many subjects as possible, would like to make this available to as many patients as possible. I think that they have limited resources and want to come up with the cleanest data possible, such that they can present that as their package to the FDA. I would imagine that the approvals are going to allow this to be used in the broad population. You know, whether or not a payer or insurance decides to be difficult in that regard is, you know, beyond anybody's control. But the hope is that once this gets through with clean data in a defined population, that it would be available to the group.
Great.
And if
Thanks,
there's,
Dr. Benke.
and I can understand how there might be follow-up questions from that. And if any appear during the chat today, I'd love to try to tackle them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And if we don't get to, and if there are follow-up questions that we don't get to related to boys specifically, or any other aspects of clinical trials and clinical studies such as the natural history study, we will do a QA document. Dr. Benke is not going to disappear at the end of this talk today. I know he is always willing to answer questions from the community, as am I, as is Colleen English from Rettland. So we appreciate you going ahead and putting as many questions as are on your mind right now into this queue, and we'll get them answered for you. The next question in the queue, though, is a question about trial design and why are some trials open label and others are randomized placebo controlled. Can you revisit that a little bit, please?
The FDA is going to look for randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials before they make an approval. So if there is an open label trial that doesn't have a placebo control or randomization as part of it, it means that it's very much a preliminary trial, like a phase 1 or phase 2A. That's where the company is with that in the process. So an open label trial, the company might be looking just to see, is it safe, or is there any evidence that this drug is useful in this phase before we proceed to the larger, more expensive effort of doing a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial.
Okay. Thank you.
I think the other aspect is there are two, as I talked about, there's two trials that have, or there are a couple of trials, more than two, that have an open label extension. So that follows the randomized double-blind placebo part, and we're very pleased when companies feel that they have the resources to provide this to families, because I think families, I think this is a nice thing that I was in the trial, it might have gotten placebo, but to reward my efforts, I'm going to get drug eventually. And so I think that that's a nice thing that companies are doing, again, of course, if they have the resources. And those resources can be anywhere, because it's expensive to carry on doing the trial, both with regards to trial infrastructure, but also due to the drug. They may only have so much of the drug available. But it appears those that are doing this, they feel that they have the drug available to do that, so they're ready to do it. And I think that's great.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's another question, and that is the natural history data incorporated into clinical trial data in any way, shape, or form?
No. So there's no talk that goes between the natural history study data and a clinical trial. They're completely separate data sets. They don't talk to each other. There's no data link between the two. The only data link would be if you've been seen by a natural history study site, then that natural history site is going to know a lot about you as to whether or not you have Rett syndrome, you have typical Rett, you have atypical Rett. They know that you have a genetic change or not in MECP2. So they're going to know a lot about you that would help with the screening process. But other than that, there's no talk between the data sets in the natural history study and drug trials. And by the way, that's something that when you sign a consent form for a clinical trial, one of the aspects is what happens to my data? Are you sharing my data with anybody else? And the answer is it's specifically written in the consent as to whether or not any data is shared with anybody, because that's something that is considered sacrosanct. Your data is so treasured and protected that what happens to it is a central aspect of every consent with every clinical trial. And if you are participating in a trial and you don't feel that your questions regarding the data are answered adequately, then that should be a concern that you can say, this sounds great, but I really want more information. And they should be able to provide that to you. I think that's a very important part of all trials as to what happens to your data.
Great, thank you very much for sharing that. It is a really important issue that everyone should be very well aware of, is the protections and privacies that are in place for every trial. And I can say from experience that the government and the FDA and the NIH hold this to be incredibly important, as does every site that participates in a clinical trial. In terms of enrollment in the natural history study, though, and how that data has been important and pivotal in the field, is that it has given great confidence to a lot of pharmaceutical companies that Rett syndrome is a well-organized, research-ready disorder. And our organization is approached every day by companies that have become interested in Rett syndrome because they have learned of the participation, longevity, and amount of data that has been collected from the natural history study, which is not something that is common across many of the 7,000 rare diseases that are out there that companies could choose to study. So I want to just take a second to thank every single family that has made the long-term commitment to participate in the natural history study, and a nod of my hat of thanks to the PIs who have so diligently collected data over the years. It has really set up our syndrome to be one of interest to many companies. And Dr. Benke, I think you could, I hope, support that statement.
Absolutely, Paige. That's a spot on, perfect point, that we wouldn't be where we are with being able to offer clinical trials in Rett syndrome if it wasn't for the natural history study. It's been your taxpayer dollars at work doing something that's been very beneficial to this, to Rett syndrome. And just coming from the American Epilepsy Society meeting, a lot of our very similar disorders don't have the natural history study, and they're not as well positioned, as Paige said, as we are, because they don't have that natural history study data. It was a great point, Paige.
Thank you. And I think that's a great closing comment to the questions that are in the queue. I think we've generally asked the big topics that have been asked by everybody in the queue, and there might be some questions that are more specific to an individual child regarding symptoms, current medical issues that you're encountering, and things that kind of go beyond the scope of today's call. I will take those questions offline and either contact you directly to talk to you about your child, or we will ask Dr. Benke to get involved. We've seen the questions, but we are limited on time. Dr. Benke and Colleen, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is take 1 minute, and I'm going to take the screen control back, and I want to show people what clinicaltrials.gov looks like. Would that be okay, Dr. Benke? Are you done with your slides?
Perfect. That's great.
Great.
Go ahead.
Okay. Colleen, how about you?
Yes, please.
Okay. Great. Let me go ahead and do this. So a lot of questions in the queue were related to how do you learn more about these individual trials? And we keep saying go to clinicaltrials.gov. So if you look up here at my URL bar, it is simply clinicaltrials.gov. You type that. And I'm not going to give you a full tutorial on how this works, but I'm going to specifically answer a question a family asked how they got in contact with GW if they're interested in the Epidiolex trial. So if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you'll see this box right here that says condition or disease. You can type in Rett syndrome. And then in the next field, you can simply type GW or Greenwich or CBD and then search. And what comes up in the search results is this study for Rett syndrome. And when you click on that, there is pages and pages of information that every trialist needs to upload into the system. But one of the important pieces of information is contact information. So you'll see outcome measures, primary, secondary, you'll see eligibility criteria, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. You don't have to become an expert on this. You can contact myself, you can contact Dr. Benke, you can contact any of the sites. But if you look down under contacts and locations, you'll see currently they only have a UK phone number. I've asked them to put up a US phone number. But if you email medinfo@gwfarm.com or medinfo@greenwichbiosciences.com, either one of those email boxes are very responsive. Email them with your interest and they'll get right back to you. And then you can scroll down and you can see that these are all of the intended sites, and you can see which ones are not yet recruiting. They're in the process of site initiation, as Dr. Benke explained. It's not from any, anything other than just working through the process to get sites initiated. But Dr. Benke's site in Colorado is recruiting. There are two other sites that I want to point out. So clinicaltrials.gov will always have at least the most common information that is publicly available, and you should check back there all the time for updated information. But there are two studies that have set up a screening website where you can go to for more information. ANAVEX, if you're interested in ANAVEX 273, they have a website called rettsyndrometrial.com. All of the information on this site is IRB approved. They have a nice video that goes through the mechanism of action, and they have a very simple screening survey to see if your child qualifies, and then a survey that you can complete if you're interested. Completing any of these surveys does not commit you to participating in a trial, but it does get you started in a conversation with the people who can help you assess if a trial is right for you. So rettsyndrometrial.com is one for ANAVEX 273. And for Acadia, rettsyndromestudies.com, rettsyndromestudies.com is a site where you can look for information on trofinetide for the Lavender and Lilac studies. And there's a lot of really good information there. Okay, so thank you for letting me share those websites. But I want to move on to another question in the queue, and thank you. I did not pay you to ask this question, but it's a very relevant one, which is concern that once these studies are done and the drugs are approved for market, that they might become so expensive that payers don't cover them. I want to make everyone aware of a current survey that we're asking all caregivers, as well as clinicians, any doctors or therapists who have seen 5 or more patients with Rett syndrome to complete. The aim of this survey is to get metadata, big data, about the burden of illness. Now, I know that that's a loaded term. Not all of us think of our children as a burden. However, I think if you asked your child, do they consider the symptoms of Rett syndrome a burden to them in being able to live a full life? The goal of this survey is to have caregivers and doctors answer a series of questions about the challenges our children face living with the symptoms of Rett syndrome. And this data will be able to use to do advocacy around funding and resources, hopefully affecting drug pricing, but as well as to advocate for a variety of other supports and services around Rett syndrome. We are hoping to get as many US participants as possible, and we do have some funding to compensate you for your time. If you would please take the time to answer this survey. For those of you who already have completed it, we appreciate it. For those of you who haven't, it'll take about a half hour of your time. If you are in the US, if you email bgibson@rettsyndrome.org, that's my colleague, Brittany Gibson, she can give you a special access code to participate in the survey that will get you a gift card in answer for your time. But really, we know that the motivation for that is to get some data that can address some of the issues of the cost and the lifetime cost of supporting our kids with all of their issues. And we're about halfway through the number of parents and caregivers that need to answer this survey, and we only have about a third of the physicians and therapists that we need to complete this survey. So we've asked all of our clinical centers of excellence to complete this survey, but I know many of you have a neurologist or a pediatrician, a physical therapist, an educator, a communication specialist who's seen multiple children with Rett syndrome over the course of their career, and we're interested in having them complete this survey as well. So if you would please, you've received emails from us, you've seen this posted on social media. We really ask you in December, I know it's a busy time of year, to please complete the survey and nudge those around you to also participate. Like anything, clinical trial, survey, questionnaires, natural history study, the sooner that we can meet the enrollment goals for any of these, the sooner the data becomes available and action can be taken. So for those of you who are feeling, I can't participate in a clinical trial, I'm excluded, I can't get to the natural history study, well, guess what? Here is an avenue that you can contribute to and your voice will be heard. So you can visit voicesofrett.org to get more information. And if you would like to be compensated for your time, just drop an email to bgibson@rettsyndrome.org and she'll send you a code.
It was
Okay.
easy to do. Paige, we've done it. Most of my people here have done it. It was very easy to do. It didn't take that long. It was not a burden. And if I could say something about the burden, it's not a burden for me to take care of your kid. I love doing it. Just to say it's code speak.
Thank you.
More than anything else. It's not us. And so we
Right.
were forced to use that.
Yeah, and I think we as parents know that sometimes when we are having to request services, we have to paint the bleakest picture about our child, and that often doesn't reflect our true feelings. And I really appreciate hearing you say that from your perspective. I know that about you and your entire team, that you do what you do because you care and you don't consider our children a burden. You consider them an inspiration, as do I. So thank you. And thank you for saying that the survey was pretty easy to complete. That is a great testimonial from somebody who's completed it. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our time today. I want to thank our presenters, for sharing information, for answering so many commonly asked questions around clinical trials. Families, attendees, I want to thank you for being with us today. I know that we ask you to always go above and beyond for your child. It's an easy thing to do because we love our children so much and we want the best world possible for them. So I want to thank again everyone who did efforts during October Awareness Month, everybody who has held fundraisers throughout the year for our foundation. You can really see the results. Your contributions to research, to answering surveys, to engaging in natural history study visits, to fundraising have resulted in communication guidelines being produced this year, caregiver guidelines being produced, and all kinds of resources that are available to you every day to help you on this journey. Our goal here is to create community and to empower you with information today. And we do ask you to also find the time to engage in research, whether that is to participate in a survey or a clinical trial. We're here to support you along the way. Dr. Benke, we couldn't do any of this without you. Rettland Foundation, many of our families could not participate in these trials without your support, so we thank you. To all of our attendees, families, clinicians, professionals, we have a nice mix today. We hope you found value in today's session and that what you learned here today will help you in ways great and small moving forward. It's complex. We're making progress. My request is that everybody continue to understand the diagnosis, continue to understand that there are ways to advocate for your nonverbal children. They are valued, they are loved, they are important. There are laws and precedents and supports in the United States secured to help you on your journey. We know those things aren't always easy to find, but we're here to help you. Believe in your children. We believe in them. We are all being part of something very special today, so thank you for being with us. Thank you for considering participating in the Burden of Illness survey. And regarding continuing education, here we are in December. It's the end of the calendar year. It is the perfect time for you to reflect on how your life was in 2019 and how you want it to be different in 2020. We hope that you'll continue to attend the monthly RettEd webcasts on a variety of topics that we have set up in response to the questions you have submitted to us. The areas that you find troublesome, we're here to find experts to address that. Next month, Tuesday, January 7th, Dr. Mario Peterson, many of you know him as the former medical director for the Rett Clinic at Oregon Health Sciences. He's now moved to Michigan. He is bilingual. He is Argentinian by birth. He's going to be delivering a session for us in January in Spanish called What is Rett Syndrome? I'm not even going to try to say that in Spanish, but it will all be in Spanish, and we hope you will please spread the word throughout your community that we'll be having that RettEd webcast in January, and many future webcasts are already open for registration. Just visit our website, and there's an entire library of past webcasts that are free and available for you to access, to revisit. Life with your child is going to change. Things that weren't relevant or a problem or an issue for you 6 months ago, maybe today. We probably have a RettEd webcast for you. Take time to go visit that library and look, and if there's a topic that you don't see in our library or in our upcoming calendar, just email me and we'll work it into the schedule. We also cannot underscore the value of getting together face-to-face. So in 2020, we're going to do 4 more Saturday Ed Days across the country. These are one-day events. We can be together in person, building community with other families, making friends, meeting with RettSyndrome.org staff, and meeting with multiple experts. And those dates and cities will be available on our website. We also want to announce, again, that we will be having a Rett Getaway June 18 to 21 in San Diego, California. So being December, if you're looking for your 2020 vacation getaway and you would like to try travel in the safety, comfort, and familiarity with other families like yours. We hope you'll consider meeting up with us in San Diego. We're going to be partnering with the Kayla Mosca Foundation and Surf Madonna. We have a hotel block, and we will be doing adapted surfing at no charge, completely subsidized and supported for every child with Rett syndrome. What a dream. I can say from our Rett getaways at Morgan's Wonderland in San Antonio, Texas in 2017 and Disney World in 2015, it was a transformative experience for so many families who never knew that they could live a life without limits. And we hope that the getaway in a way will be life coaching, and in a way will just be an opportunity for you to have a vacation with families who travel at the speed of ours. So visit rettsyndrome.org for families, education, and you can get more information about all of these events in 2020. And so on that note, and with those thoughts, we wish you all wonderful holiday season. Thank you for being with us today. You will receive a link to the recording probably by tomorrow, and we hope that you share it. Again, thank you for being with us, and that concludes our webinar for today. Bye-bye.